I got a new book.
I talked previously about how children from the state public school in Sparta, Wisconsin were actually indentured out as farm labor. This book is actually the result of a study that led to the advent of foster homes in Wisconsin. School officials actually started researching the circumstances that brought children to the state public school, as well as how they did in placement, and tried to follow them afterwards. They even included interviews with the child's natural family. I've only just begun digging into this book, but one thing that really struck me funny was that they would prorate the indenture fee. If you kept a child until they were 18, you would owe the school $50. However, if you returned them early, you owe them less. So for example, if you kept a child until they were 12, you would owe the school $12.50. If you kept them until 15, you owed the school $31.25. The school would retain these funds until the child turned 21. So pretty much if the indenture didn't work out, you didn't have to pay as much. Indentured children. So we've already discussed previously that the state public school in Sparta, Wisconsin would indenture children out. While this sounds horrible in today's terms, it wasn't intended to be back then. The world was a completely different place back then. Indenturing was intended to provide the child a home and teach them a skill. The state public school was never intended to be a long-term solution for kids. And to the school, indenturing them out was better than them sitting there forever. One really interesting and progressive for the time thing that I found in this book is that corporal punishment was forbidden on indenture. A rule of the state public school prohibits the corporal punishment of the child, a prohibition to which many foster parents objected and which unfortunately some violated. At the time, corporal punishment was a very normal thing. So given the era and the culture at the time, it's very interesting that it was forbidden. What's alarming is that many people violated this rule. Kids were physically punished. Indentured children, part 3. So as I mentioned in the last video, corporal punishment was expressly prohibited. Families who took a child on indenture were not allowed to hit them. They couldn't smack them, they couldn't hit them, they couldn't whip them, they couldn't spank them, none of it. But because the school only had 2 agents to check on indentured children, this often went unnoticed when children were being beat. With such a wide area to cover and so many children placed on indenture, the agents simply couldn't keep up. One foster mother was reported to have beaten a child to break him of self-harm habits. She later questioned if it was the right thing to do. Other foster parents reported that they whipped the children for bedwetting, for lying, for not going to school, for not working, for disobedience, etc. One boy was moved from an indenture home to another indenture home, where his new foster mother said he arrived at her home covered in blood-soaked shirts from being beaten so badly at the previous home. The school couldn't follow up with these kids on indenture. Indentured children, part 4. So it's already bad enough that the state public school hasn't been able to follow up with these kids out on indenture. There were many cases and reports of abuse and neglect in these homes. Many children were just given the bare minimum to keep them alive and treated as nothing but labor. Even though the school made it clear that these children should be treated as part of the family. They were supposed to get education and they often wouldn't receive it. To make it even worse, 2 of the agents that were responsible for checking on the welfare of these children out on indenture were accused of severe corporal punishment of these said children. One foster mother even made a report to the school. She had requested that the agent talk to the foster daughter about her behavior to kind of get an idea what's going on, see if there's anything they could change to improve the situation. And instead, the agent jumped on her and threatened to take her back to the school if she didn't behave. So the people responsible for keeping them safe were endangering them. Indentured children, part 5. So one thing that really needs to be addressed is that indenturing a child in that era was not abnormal. It meant a roof over their head, food in their bellies, and hopefully education. But a lot of people didn't live up to the requirements. It was a regular occurrence for families to indenture a child and refuse to pay the fee, part of which went to the child. Money aside, abuse was the biggest concern. Such as the case of a boy named Otto Schultz, who was indentured by a man named Fred Cuff. Otto was only 10 years old, and Fred beat him so badly that his clothes were sticking to his wounds. The school ultimately settled with Mr. Cuff for $150. Otto wasn't the only abused child to make the news. A 15-year-old girl was abused repeatedly by the family she was indentured to. She was covered in scars. This girl was treated like a slave. If she couldn't find all the cows at nightfall, she would sleep in the woods out of fear of being beaten. The supervision of indenture was a serious problem. Indentured children, part 6. So what exactly were the requirements to indenture a child from the state public school in Sparta, Wisconsin? There were actually quite a few requirements. The very first requirement was to keep the child as a member of the family. They wanted these kids to feel loved and appreciated and as if they belong. They also had to agree to educate the child. The children had to attend school for a certain number of months per year until they turned 16. The family also had to agree to teach the child a trade. For girls, this could be housekeeping, cooking, embroidery, basket weaving. And for boys, this was typically farm labor. At the end of the contract, they had to pay the $50 fee or the prorated amount for each year they kept the child after their 10th birthday. If the school decided to cancel the contract, it was the responsibility of the family to return the child to the school, regardless of expenses incurred. And lastly, the family had to allow the child to correspond with school officials. They really did try to make it a good program. Indentured Children, Part 7. The state recognized the need for supervision after indenture, but it wasn't until 1907 they were even able to add a third agent to check on these homes. They were supposed to be checking the children every 6 months. One indentured girl reported having waited 3 years to tell an agent she was being overworked and abused. She ultimately ran away before she could tell them. Another girl tried to get removed from the home she was indentured to due to abuse and overworking. It took 2 complaints. The first one, they denied, claiming she was unclean and of immoral character. They finally removed her 3 years later after another indentured child from another school was removed due to unfit conditions. Many families didn't even send the kids to school. They'd rather they stay home and worked on the farm, despite the contract. In an especially heartbreaking case, a young girl died while on indenture, and the school didn't find out for months until they went to visit her. No one knows how she died.